I'm going to introduce Kristen, and she's going to tell you about Dance Safe. Thank you.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for having me at the front porch, and thank you for having Dance Safe out to fair for the first time. Before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out to Sloan Ferenchek. She is my coworker and the We Love Consent program coordinator. We were supposed to be doing this talk together today. However, she had an unexpected emergency and therefore is unable to join us. Much of what you are going to hear today has either been developed by Sloan or in partnership with Sloan, so just to honor her and her work, I wanted to have that quick note. My name is Kristen Harris. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Chief Operating Officer for Dance Safe. If you don't know who Dance Safe is a 501c3 public health nonprofit that promotes health and safety within the electronic music, nightlife, and festival communities. We've actually been around since 1998, so this is far from our first rodeo. We are a chapter-based organization, so what that means is that we have groupings of volunteers across the United States that come together as chapters, 100% volunteer-led, to provide our services. Dance Safe services what Dance Safe services look like at an event. Often we have a branded 10 by 10 where you can find tables that are stocked with as an access point to our services, coupled with educational literature and peer education. So for example, we have free water, information about heat stroke, free condoms, information about consent, free earplugs, information about hearing damage, and then what we are really well known for is the provision of drug checking when we're allowed. So people will bring Dance Safe their substances to get tested to see if they have been misrepresented at point of sale, and if there's any other additional information that we can tell them so that they can make more informed decisions about their minds and bodies, as well as the drug education that is coupled with that. While you're here, you can find Dance Safe in Xanadu at Rainbow Connection. If you're interested in finding us, you can go over to Kitty, one of my colleagues. She is the one of the officers actually for Portland Dance Safe. She has some cards with some information that you can snag if you would like to find us and link up with us later. As for a little bit about me, I've been working for Dance Safe coming up I'm at like 6.5 going on 7 years. I've held a lot of different roles inside Dance Safe. I've gone from volunteer to intern to coordinator, coordinator to manager, and now I am the Chief Operating Officer for Dance Safe. I come from a background in public health. I got involved because I got introduced to structural violence by way of some courses that I was taking, and that coincided with friends of mine starting to experiment with altered states of consciousness, when I quickly realized that they themselves were not educated about what they were putting in their bodies. And that's when I stepped into the role as their peer educator, and it's kind of been history ever since. These days, my role really focuses on guiding and supporting strategic planning, project management, program development, including We Love Consent, which is the program that I'll be speaking from today, chapter development and outreach. We Love Consent is our consent program. The mission of We Love Consent is to help dismantle rape culture and build a consent culture within the communities that we serve. Yeah, thank you. And so the program seeks to mobilize the community by building a consent culture and reducing incidences of sexual violence in settings through consent education and bystander intervention. So, why are we even having this conversation? So certainly, I think we are all well oriented to the idea of reducing risks and reducing harm. I think that's the focal point of a lot of these conversations. We want to reduce harm in our communities, whether that is sexual violence or other forms of power-based violence, and all of that is extremely important. I want to add to that while there is a focus on the elimination of harm, I also believe in positive health. If you can think of harm as having a value of -3, if we were to eliminate it, we would have a value of 0. But what does it look like for us to actually step into positive health? What does it look like to have a +3 value? I believe that is something that consent can and does provide us. As you get better at navigating consent, I believe that you have a richer life. You have richer connection, you have richer opportunities for pleasure, and consent is really a pathway towards benefit maximization as well as risk reduction and harm reduction. So I'm going to take a little choose your own adventure type of approach to this. I'm curious for those that are currently in the crowd, by a show of hands, how many of you feel confident defining consent? Okay. For the next show of hands, how many of you feel confident teaching the basics of consent to a friend? Hi. All right. Next, how many of you feel like you can confidently name the major components that must be present to move towards a consent culture? Okay. And lastly, how many of you feel confident in acting as an active bystander and intervening in a situation where consent is not respected and you see it happening? So for some of you, it seems like there's like a bit of a mix for all of these topics. So for some of you, this might be a repeat and a refresh, and for some of you, this might be completely brand new. I'm going to start out by introducing the concept of consent culture versus a rape culture. I'm going to dip into some consent 101, probably take a pit stop and talk about power dynamics. And I'd like to end on discussing bystander intervention, since I think that is a valuable skill set that you can leave this talk today and make an active difference in the community for the people around you at FAIR. So first things first, in terms of a consent culture, consent culture normalizes the action of asking for consent and respecting when responses are given. It affirms that each individual has bodily autonomy and maintains boundaries, a person's right to choose what is comfortable for them, and should be respected unconditionally. Now, in contrast, unfortunately, our society very much has an orientation towards having a rape culture, where the environment has prevailing social attitudes that affect the normalizing or trivializing of sexual violence. I will also say that this is true for all forms of power-based violence. Think of the many isms from racism to ableism. Throughout this conversation, consent has had this major focus on sexual consent. But most of what my talk is going to focus on is consent as a practice, as a way of being, as it should be. So with that, I know that it can be really uncomfortable to exist in a society that does have a rape culture. And so I just want to acknowledge that rape culture does permeate all social boundaries, and our community is not immune to its underpinnings. It's true that as a community, there's many pockets that do have stronger consent practices, but I want to encourage people to remain humble and curious and open to growth, because that is part of what is going to propel us into a consent culture and help us deepen into that practice. I'm a believer in being a lifelong learner. I do not think that there is ever a cap to which we are able to learn and grow. And so I invite you into that headspace while you're here today. I think that now more than ever, it's important for our community to take it upon themselves to learn about these situations, and to be able to be educated and be able to respond to the world around them. And so while it's true that it's only the person or persons that are causing harm that are the perpetrator, we all have the ability to look out for each other. It's not a individual thing. This is in fact a collective thing. And so with that, I just want to encourage everyone in our community to be curious and take this talk as an invitation to be better. So with that, consent 101. Like, what is consent? Consent's a practice that's based on respecting of boundaries. So I feel like a lot of times people have a really strong understanding that consent in terms of physical boundaries, but it's a lot more than that. It's about emotional boundaries, it's about mental boundaries, it's about spiritual boundaries. There's all sorts of like facets and way of being that we exist in, and that boundaries are incredibly important for. So with that, a handy little acronym that people really like referencing is FRIES, to help orient people to what consent is. So consent is freely given. So this means with the absence of coercion, it is reversible. Consent is an ongoing practice that can be reversed at any time. Someone can give you consent in the moment for something, and they can choose to revoke that, and that is their right. Consent is also enthusiastic. I feel that consent is something, other ways to think about this is that consent is engaged, consent is embodied. It may be any one of these three things. There is a emphasis on consent being enthusiastic. I think that this is a really important compensation for our existence in a rape culture, and for those of you that have a deeper, more nuanced understanding of consent, I also want to be able to acknowledge that consent can be really nuanced, and sometimes it doesn't always look enthusiastic. And so, like, the example I like to give is like, do I really want to do my partner's laundry for the 1 billionth time sometimes? No. But am I willing and consenting to do that because I love him? Yes. In that moment, I am making an active decision to push myself slightly outside of what my ideal boundary might be, and is within my boundary tolerance, you could say. And so I want to be able to honor the complexity of that. But for all intents and purposes, if you are new to someone, if a situation feels a little bit more rocky, you should definitely be shooting for enthusiastic consent. You want an affirmative yes. The absence of a no is not a yes. And then consent is specific. So if I give you consent to hug me, I am not giving you consent to kiss me. Those two, you need specific consent for each of those individual acts. And so consent should also be specific. Something else we like to talk about through We Love Consent is the concept of give respect and getting respect. Where in respecting, like, R is to respect that everyone is different, E is empathy, to listen and connect, S is to self-monitor and think first, T is for thoughts, feelings, intent, and biases, and the second S is for self-reflection and awareness, P is for personal space, E is to earn trust through your actions, and T is to treat everyone as an equal. The last thing I'd like to touch on in terms of consent basics is like this idea of establishing mutual consent as opposed to getting consent. Getting consent, when we talk about consent at DanceSafe, we talk about it as this mutual establishment of consent rather than getting consent, because getting consent just sounds transactional. It's like, oh, I just need to check a box. I need them to just say yes once, and oh, I have gotten consent. No, actually, that's not how that works. We have already just talked about the fact that consent is an ongoing active practice. You should be checking in with people to see if they have updated boundaries, and you should be checking in with yourself to also see if you have updated boundaries that you want to communicate to others. So that's really what I wanted to say in terms of just like some consent basics and like 101 and some lingo there. The next piece I think that is super critical in terms of like addressing the curation of a consent culture is addressing power dynamics and holding that they are inherent to all of our interactions based off of whatever our access to power in this world might look like. So power is the ability to influence actions, choices, and or the well-being of others. Power is a tool that makes it easier to connect with others or acquire resources that improve your livelihood or social standing. Sometimes it can be obvious, and sometimes it can be less obvious. Some examples of types of power include financial, physical, intellectual, institutional, social, experiential, emotional, political, and that's just some examples. In terms of power dynamics, how we define that is they describe the difference in power and influence and impact on relationships. They can exist as a result of hierarchies of power and oppression that precede certain individuals and marginalize others. So within power dynamics, there can be power imbalances. So a power imbalance is when one person has the ability to influence others due to the differential in power. There being a power imbalance is not inherently a bad thing. This is a naturally occurring thing within our society, within our relationships. Power imbalances are a problem when there is an issue with manipulation or when it's causing harm, whether that is intentional or unintentional, because you can be in a position of power, and if you are not navigating that mindfully, you are at risk of being in a situation where there is an influence on someone, and that may lead to crossing of boundaries, and that won't feel good. So with that, just noting that coercion is when a person who holds power pressures, threatens, or forces someone else into an unwanted activity in a non-physical way. It's also important to note that persons with less power may feel pressured, like they owe the person who's in the position of power something, or that they feel overpowered or disempowered, and therefore it impacts how they and that can affect how they're showing up in a situation from them stepping into their power. And power dynamics can actually make it really difficult sometimes to recognize whether or not consent is freely given. Which means we need to make sure that people feel free to be able to say no. If you're asking someone for something and there's not space for them to say no, it wasn't a question. You weren't really actually making a request. It's also important to note that power dynamics can shift in context. So you can have two individuals who are in one context where one person is in the position of power. So let's say there's two people that are at fair. There is one person who is new to fair. There is one person that's been going to fair for 10 years. The person who's going to fair for 10 years there is a power differential there, and there may be a power imbalance that's in their favor. You can take those same two individuals and you can plop them in, let's say, Burning Man. And maybe the person who had never been to fair has been going to Burning Man for 10 years, and the person who had went to fair for 10 years has never been to the burn. And that's an example of how power dynamics can shift between two individuals based off of context. So what do we do about power dynamics? Well, first we should name it to tame it. This is something that I try to practice often as someone that's in a position of leadership. When I'm talking to people that report to me inside my organization and I'm talking with them, I repeatedly, time and time again, not once, not twice, regularly remind them, if I'm making a request, that they have the option to say no. Making sure I'm checking in with them, and if they're saying yes to me, that they don't feel pressure to try to like, I have to take on this work because it's really critical. The work we're doing is important. Like, this is important to get done right now. I like check in with them to make sure that they are respecting their own boundaries and what their own capacity is. And that's just like one example. It's also can be really part of that. What I highlighted is also an invitation to say no. Sometimes people need that extra push and reminder to be like, hey, like, it's okay for you to say no right now. And also make sure that you have those ongoing conversations and check in. So with that, I want to touch real quick on ownership and accountability. Being that we're human, our experience can be a little messy sometimes, and there's times where harm may be intentional, but honestly a lot of the time a lot of harm is unintentional. And so part of stepping into a consent culture is being prepared to engage in ownership and accountability, to be able to step into repair. So ownership is the initiative and personal commitment to do what is needed and ideally repair harm. In this context, harm is caused or perpetuated by mistakes in respecting people's boundaries, respecting the boundaries of others. So ownership inside of community involves taking responsibility for mistakes rather than denying them, making excuses for them, or placing blame elsewhere. Like, that is key in stepping into ownership. And so it's actually, we have some of these cards. I really encourage you, if you want to like start to build up your skills and have a quick guide for stepping into ownership and accountability, come by our table. I also have some on me. It talks about like, what do you do in a situation where you may have fucked up, and one of the things it goes into on the chart is first figuring out, like, is the person that you've harmed, like, are they open to talking to you? Because like, they don't owe you repair, right? They don't have to say yes to having a conversation with you to repair after you have harmed them. If they are open to it, it's important to check in and listen. And it's important also, like, before you're stepping into this process, be aware, like, what are your motives? Like, are you showing up from a place of like true remorse, or are you trying to just save face? If you're just trying to save face, then it's not an appropriate time for you to be stepping into ownership and accountability with someone, because that means you're doing it for you and not for them. And so I highly recommend that, like, you pick up these cards. There's a great little flow chart on it, and it helps you kind of walk through the process as you're building up that skill. And the next piece is like taking accountability. So ownership is stepping up and saying, like, I did this. Accountability is the changed behavior. It's taking action for your responsibilities, and figuring out what you need to do to, repair and or prevent yourself from causing that same harm again. So like, that could look like accountability involves follow through and transparency. While you can be accountable without having all the answers, the key is making sure that you're actively engaged in finding a solution. And it's a process that requires being open to feedback from those that you harmed and from the community around you. So that's just like a little one-on-one on ownership and accountability. So far we've covered like the having consent education is key, recognizing and figuring out how to navigate power dynamics, being able to step into ownership and accountability when you've caused harm. And another piece is when you are in community, how do you take action when you see something? So that's bystander intervention. So some things to know regarding bystander intervention is it's not something you just know how to do or that it's done just on a whim. It's actually a skill set that is something that you learn and step into with practice and intention. Many situations actually can require more than one intervention. Bystander intervention is also a way of actively challenging harassment culture and practicing community care. And community can stop a situation from escalating to a place where there is additional or deeper harm, and that members have the opportunity to create safer spaces for themselves and others. So first and foremost, like, what is a bystander? If this term is new to you, a bystander is someone who witnesses an incident but is not directly involved in the event that is taking place. The thing that we look to cultivate are people stepping into the role of being an active bystander. So an active bystander is someone who makes a choice to intervene in a potentially harmful situation. I want to say that anyone can be an active bystander, whether you are the most outgoing extrovert or super shy. There's different techniques that can meet you where you're at in the process of speaking up and ensuring that a situation is addressed. Something else I want to also comment on is the bystander effect. There's actually a phenomenon when we are existing in large groups and crowds where if you are a witness to something, there will actually be this sense of like distributed responsibility where someone may have like the cognition of, oh, well, someone's going to say something. And people fall into this trap where like, oh, someone is going to say something, and everyone around them is thinking that, and then no one actually says anything, which is why it's important to be an active bystander. There cannot be too many active bystanders in a situation to try to intervene with a situation where someone's boundaries are being violated and they are at risk or actively in a place of receiving harm. So how do we do this? How do we step into this role of being an active bystander? So first and foremost, before you intervene, there's going to be some checks that you're going to do for yourself. First, you're going to do a safety check. You're going to check your surroundings, your environment, and you're going to assess who may be the safest person to get involved in the situation. It might not be you. It might be someone else. A permission check. This isn't ideal, but may not always be accessible at the time, but a permission check is to attempt to try to get permission from the target to intervene. This is very situationally specific, whether or not this is actually accessible in the moment. But having permission from the person and having some information may actually give you more information about what is the best route for you to take. Also doing a bias check. So double check that you've discerned that there's actually a real need for an intervention, and that you are not acting out of a place of assumptions, stereotypes, or bias. And then lastly, a self-check. Like, think about your plan and confirm that that if you were to be moving ahead, that this feels right for you. Because like I said, there are different interventions that it doesn't have to be you, and we're going to get into that. So, I'm going to introduce you to the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. Number 1 is being direct. And when you're being direct, you could be either direct with the target or you could be direct with the perpetrator. So if you were being direct with the target, one would be one way to be directed is to ask the person, targeted, what they would like. Asking someone what they need can help you figure out who else you might need to include, or you can directly address the harasser. This involves naming the behavior and what you want to happen next. So for example, one might say, talking about people's bodies that way makes me feel uncomfortable. Let's pick a new topic. So you've identified what makes you feel uncomfortable and you're indicating what you want to happen next. So that's a summary of the first D of being direct. The second D is de-escalation. So this intervention involves shifting the dynamic that is at play, that from being unsafe or uncomfortable to avoid further escalation. So what that can look like is removing either the target or the perpetrator that's involved from the situation. So that could be this might look like you pretend knowing the target, asking them if they'll like help, like where the bathroom is, or like, oh, do you know who's this artist that's playing right now? Or it could also look like asking them if they, like, you could pretend that, like, be like, hey, would you like to come join us all for this insert excursion? This can also, there's some overlap with the third D of being a distraction, which is redirecting the attention of the target onto yourself. That could be by doing something awkward. It could be doing something silly. Certainly in an environment like this, it's very easy to stage a distraction and it look like it's just the thing that's happening in the moment. It may not even be detectable as being a intervention at the time. One of the most important of the 5Ds that I really like to point out to people is this concept of delegating. So going back to before when I said anyone can be an active bystander regardless of how outgoing you are, how shy you are. If you're on the shy side, if you don't feel like the situation's right for you, delegating is your intervention of choice. So when you're delegating, this method involves sharing responsibility to intervene with someone else. And so you can delegate to a friend and that could be of the target. So you could be like, hey, like, I think that your friend looks uncomfortable. Or you can also delegate to the friends of a perpetrator. So you can like say, hey, like, your friend is making this person feel uncomfortable, like, can you intervene? And delegate to that someone. There's also times where it's appropriate to delegate to event staff. So finding someone that's like in a security position or in some other leadership role within the event structure that can intervene. It's all about reading the situation and seeing what might be appropriate. The last D is delay. So in a scenario where there is a delay, there's one of two ways that this could happen. It could be a situation where you have just come into a situation and something has just happened, which means you kind of missed the boat of initially intervening. Or it can be a situation where, like, who knows, like maybe it was a really like small group situation and there wasn't someone around for you to easily delegate to, and it was not safe for you to intervene in that moment. This is addressing the situation after the fact. So to delay means sticking around to check in on the targeted person. This can help ground them, support them, and help them feel seen and less alone. You can do this regardless of whether or not someone has intervened. If no one did anything in the moment, you could say something like, I saw what just happened. I'm so sorry. Nobody did anything, including me. Like, what do you need right now? You can also ask them, like, what do they need to feel safe? Like, if they want to leave the show, you can make an offer of helping them find, like, a easy exit and help them figure out a plan to get to their destination. And it's also important in this window to check in on yourself. It can be really dysregulating to be in a situation where you've just been witness to harm. If you have intervened, it is possible that you may receive some form of retaliation. So it's important to check in with yourself and have a moment to allow yourself a few minutes to recover and see what you might need to self-soothe and take care of yourself. So that could also look like seeking out the support of one of your friends if you have them around. So those are the ins and outs of bystander intervention, which is really what I wanted to leave with you all today. There's certainly no shortage of things that you could talk about when it comes to consent. The other thing that I want to give a mention to in terms of one of the other key components to be able to create a consent culture in our society is also to be able to support survivors. People that are experiencing sexual violence or other forms of power-based violence, It's important to figure out how to meet them where they're at in the moment, if it's just happened or if it's after the fact. I think that all of us in society could be doing a lot more to position ourselves to be more trauma informed. Trauma is way more common than I think any of us really want to admit to ourselves. And so putting in the work to be educated, to be able to support people that have been in these difficult situations is really important. Some of the really basic in and outs of survivor support is like, first and foremost, like, believe them, listen to them, hear them, be active in hearing them, not passive. Don't project your own story onto the situation. It's about showing up for them in this moment and figuring out what it is that they need to feel supported. When you are talking with them, you can make an offer of, like, you know, is this something that you want to talk about right now? Is this something you want to unpack? It has to be crystal clear that there is never an expectation for them to share. If they're not in the space where they want to process, doing so can be re-traumatizing, adding insult to injury. It's also you know, not your place to say if and when a survivor should talk about whatever may have transpired. When you're talking with them, you should not ask for details of the assault or whatever the situation was. They can be forthcoming about that if they choose. It's very possible that you could have this like reflex to try to have a better, deeper understanding of what happened, so that you could be more informed, so you can figure out what to do. But instead, you should be centering them in their experience and seeing what it is that they need in the moment, and make sure that you're showing up in a non-judgmental way. So being accepting, being genuine, being compassionate. Like I mentioned earlier, another part of this is believing them when they say that they're hurt, scared, angry, etc. Survivors may doubt their experience and blame themselves. You should never shame or victim blame a survivor. It's never the survivor's fault, because consent is always mandatory. And make it clear to them that what happened was not their fault. And make sure that they believe you, like that they know that you believe them about what their experience was. This might, and I think a common thing that I hear people start to try to bring up around this area is like, well, what if a situation didn't actually happen the way that they said, or whatever. In the process, this person, they had their experience, and their experience is real. What their interpretation of a scenario was. And so that's why it can be helpful to focus on validating the feelings that are coming up for them. Like, oh yes, I hear if XYZ happened, I would also feel scared. That makes sense. It could be really important to just say thank you. Thank you for letting them in. Thank you for trusting me, and having the courage to speak to me about this. I feel like more or less that is what I have to say on some of these core components. Just like with bystander intervention in the scenarios where you may be holding space for a survivor, when it's important to make sure you're self-monitoring your reactions, that you're not projecting your experience, that you're making sure that you're assessing what your needs are. There may be times where you need to tap out. You're not the right person for this situation anymore. Maybe that's a good time where you can bring back that skill of delegation that you learned with bystander intervention. And figuring out what you need to take care of yourself. There can be vicarious trauma through hearing people's experiences. So know that is a risk when you step into these spaces of choosing to offer support. You could also communicate your boundaries ahead of time to help create a space where both them and you can feel safe. So with that, I don't know how much time there is. Yeah, should I let them ask questions? If anyone has any questions, I'd be open to taking some. My ask is, if you have a question, that you first give consideration. The question is actually helpful to speak into this space. Friendly reminder, questions end with question marks. They are not statements. I'm not going to accept statements at this time. If you think that the question is something that can make someone feel uncomfortable, I'm also happy to stick around for some one-on-one conversations. Just keeping the context of consent culture in mind as we move into the Q&A is all I ask.
Well, if there's no questions, please give it up for Kristen, and Dance Safe, please. Keeping us and our children safe in all these amazing venues. What a great organization. Thank you so much.